conversation. It's now my pleasure to introduce the panel members. We have Ahmed, Yussuf, Cheng, and Nasya Bahfen. Ahmed is a writer and journalist. He is currently the digital producer for ABC News Breakfast and was formerly the digital reporter at SBS's The Feed. Ahmed co-edited Growing Up African in Australia, the first non-fiction anthology of African diaspora stories in Australia. Cheng is the Industry Diversity Manager in SBS's Television and Online Content Division. Michelle supports SBS's content and industry initiatives focused on providing tangible pathways and opportunities for diverse practitioners underrepresented in the sector. She's worked as a media advisor with a background in TV presenting and writing, journalism, and law. And Michelle is also the co-chair of the Screen Diversity Inclusion Network. And last but not least, Nasya Bahfen is a senior lecturer in journalism at LaTrobe University. She runs the Masters in Journalism and is a researcher with the Centre for Sport and Social Impact. Her research looks at the intersections of new media, sport, and diversity. Nasya teaches journalism and sports journalism and is also the postgraduate research coordinator for media. She has a PhD in the sociology of media and worked as a reporter and producer for 15 years at SBS and the ABC. Welcome, everyone. I thought a nice place to start might be to take a current look at the state of the media industry presently. Michelle, it might be nice to start with you. You were appointed into one of the first dedicated diversity and inclusion roles at any of the broadcasters. Can you tell us a little bit about your remit and where we currently sit in terms of on-screen representation in the film and television industry?
Yeah, absolutely, Donna. So for a little bit of context, my name is Michelle Cheng, and I started in this role at SBS in January. I sit in the TV and online content division, and in a nutshell, my remit is to increase diversity of people on screen and off screen, particularly across our commission slate, which includes our dramas, scripted, and also our documentaries. So I suppose I can speak to the more TV and sort of commission content portion of our sector. I would say that we are seeing a bit of a shift in the industry. So in my other role, I co-chair the Screen Diversity and Inclusion Network, which is a collective of Australian film and TV organisations, including 7, 9, 10, ABC, SBS funders, and various industry bodies. And we've come together because we recognise that we do want to make that shift and get a bit more representation. I suppose if we look at what's appearing on TV screens, we are seeing a growing appetite from audiences to see stories about people that look more like them and reflect Australian society truly. But I think an area that I'm particularly interested in focusing on is the off-screen kind of role. So who is making those creative decisions? And who is, I suppose you could say, financing what stories do get made. I think that's something that we really need to focus on.
And how does the industry in Australia compare to elsewhere, say the UK or the US?
Yeah, certainly. I think I have been investigating international best practice as part of my SBS role. So that involves speaking to our counterparts and other broadcasters in, I've started with the other English-speaking nations, so the UK, US, Canada, and New Zealand. I think one country that is industry best practice would be the UK. So a lot of their broadcasters do have diversity targets, and it's on the agenda, in part because they've come together as an industry. There's an organisation called the Creative Diversity Network, which brings together broadcasters, industry funders, and bodies. And for the past couple of years, they've been taking stock of what the UK film and TV industry looks like in terms of diversity. So they do this national diversity survey every year called Project Diamond, and it's allowed them to identify some areas where we do need to improve. For instance, disability representation, because that's allowed them to benchmark where the industry is at and then identify some areas for change.
And you're part of an effort to try and develop a similar kind of benchmarking system here in Australia, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So as part of the Screen Diversity and Inclusion Network, we're leading this national data collection project, which to the best of my knowledge, is only the second in the world. It's called the Everyone Project, and all of our members, so broadcasters, funders, and various bodies, we've agreed to try and measure the cast and crew diversity of all Australian film and TV productions going forward. So it's no small feat, but the idea is that many of our members have started collecting the data this year. And what that looks like is we encourage our production partners to ask cast and crew to take a voluntary, 2-minute demographic survey, which asks them about various diversity characteristics. And the idea is when we have enough volume of data, perhaps midway next year, depending on how things go, we'll be able to have a better idea of diversity in the Australian film and TV industry, because we don't actually have any official data on that yet. So we're really excited to be able to benchmark where we're at. That will give us the what. And, as we work towards that, we're also working on diagnosing, the why. What are the barriers that, people of different diversities might face when trying to enter the industry? And how can we create more meaningful career paths for them?
Mm-hmm. Nasya, I might bring you in now. I suppose in journalism specifically, as a kind of subsection of the media industry, we know that the Australian journalism industry doesn't reflect the makeup of the wider community. Where do we sit now in terms of journalists, and whether that's broadcast or online and print? Where do we sit compared to, say, 5 or 10 years ago? Nasya, we might come back to you. I think your microphone, there might be some audio troubles there. So we might come back to you in a second, but I'll jump to you, Ahmed. Ahmed, you've been doing some excellent reporting on diverse communities, particularly throughout the COVID pandemic. Can you tell us a little bit about your role at the ABC, and also the focus for you over the past 18 months of the pandemic?
That's hard to. Well, I guess my role is, I guess what I try to do is sort of try to find gaps in what's not being told. Like, I remember there's a story I did when I was at SBS. There were anti-lockdown protests happening in Broadmeadows and Roxburgh Park, and a lot of people were like, "Oh, lots of all these anti-lockdown protests," and sort of missing the nuance in why these people who live in Broadmeadows and Roxburgh Park, who culturally diverse, who low socioeconomic sort of working class areas, why are they protesting lockdown? And then sort of trying to find why this sort of subsect of people might have different reasons to, obviously they should not be protesting lockdown, obviously, but different reasons as to why they were, versus, say, I guess the sort of anti-lockdown protests we've seen over the last 18 months, and I guess sort of trying to find things that aren't being, I guess also something that Michelle touched on, sort of trying to understand our diverse communities as well. Sort of like, there's a lot of talk about Victoria is very multicultural, Australia is very multicultural, but it's very difficult to define that. And something that Michelle mentioned was sort of measuring data. We don't really do that very well in Australia. And so I guess sort of like, this is very rambly, but like trying to sort of map out stories that aren't being told properly, or getting voices that feel not comfortable talking to the everyday, maybe white reporter. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
In terms of data, I had a quick look at some stats. There was a Deakin University report last year, which found that Australians of Indigenous and non-European backgrounds make up about 24% of the Australian population, but appear on television news screens for only about 6% of broadcast time. I think we may have resolved Nasya's audio issues, so I might come back to you, Nasya, in terms of where the industry sits compared to a decade ago or even 5 years ago. Oh, I think the audio is still not working, unfortunately. Sorry about that. No, we're still not able to hear Nasya. We'll come back to you, Nasya. You'll definitely get a chance to have a say. Ahmed, just to continue on what we were talking about, in terms of, I guess, the flow-on effects of having, I guess, journalists with lived experience of different cultural groups, or even, a diversity of journalists working within media, what kind of benefits does that confer to us as people working in this industry, and as, I guess, also to our audiences?
Sorry, I think I was frozen for a second and I just missed the end of that question.
Right. In terms of so my question was about the flow-on effects of having diverse journalists working in media, and the benefits that confers to both our audiences and, I guess, people working within the industry itself.
Oh, it changes everything. Like, it's like if you've got like if you there's just so many stories being missed. Like, I remember when the hard lockdown happened last year in North Melbourne and Flemington. I have a lot of family, friends, cousins who live in live in sort of the flats in North Melbourne and Flemington. So I was able to interview a lot of people because of that. But had I not known them, and I remember at the time a lot of people like trying to sort of get in touch with these very young people who were, I guess, posting on Instagram and Twitter and Snapchat and all these other social media platforms about how they're feeling, um, and getting these like very young people who are also vulnerable and feeling, I guess, not in the best headspace, getting them on national television, or putting them in a story with their photo, where I think, I don't know, you could have probably looked for someone who's slightly older, who might be able to, I guess, be in a better space or in a better place to sort of articulate some of those issues. But the reality is that those people who were on social media at the time, at the very beginning of it, like the first couple of days, were the entry point for a lot of media outlets. And I think I guess that's an indictment. And now we've seen over the last 18 months now this sort of interest in public housing, where there was not to say there wasn't an interest, but there was very few people highlighting sort of whether they be the living conditions, whether they be history of, I guess, policing in the area, whether it be all these other factors that come into people who live in public housing. But now, because of that moment, also communities have been able to get more integrated with media and know how to get their messages across. So I get having a diverse media allows so many entry points, and particularly for young journalists who are wanting to get into media, from sort of diverse backgrounds. Don't ever feel like you don't have something to offer, because there are stories and people that you know and you can speak to that so many journalists who are in the industry have no access to. They don't know who they are. They don't know where to go. And I think that's sort of not say that that's a strength that I don't think people recognize or utilize enough. I think in the industry, like even for me, like you sort of mentioned, I've been doing some good reporting over the 18 months before the pandemic. Like in January of 2020, before I started at SBS, I was like on Newstart working for doing work for the doll. So like my aptitude to do the work that I was doing didn't really change when I was on sort of like Newstart, struggling to find a job in journalism, versus when I did get my job and then these stories. So I guess another thing is that there are so many people who are very talented, um, that just don't have one, the entry point to get into the space, and that access I think is such a massive issue. And if you look at, there's been countless studies about the sort of makeup of Australian journalism, and it's very white, it's very middle class, and the sort of, even like the universities in which people come into journalism from is very is sort of yeah, it's very concentrated, if that makes sense. Yes, as well. Yeah. Which I'm sure Nasya could speak about as well, a lot about.
Yeah, we're going to throw to you, Nasya, hopefully third time's a charm with your audio. You know, as a follow-on from Ahmed's point, you teach journalism in universities, and I think you'd be you have a very unique perspective, I suppose, in terms of the young people who are choosing to study it. And I'm wondering, in terms of those barriers to access, if you could talk a little bit about that in terms of entering the industry, and also whether you have seen changes in the past few years.
Okay, so following on from what Ahmed was talking about, 20 years ago, I was a journalism student. I was an undergrad journalism student, and I was the only non-white person within that cohort. And it was one of those universities that Ahmed was talking about where every other person who wanted to get into this industry was somebody who came from an incredibly privileged background. And that's neither good nor bad. That was simply the makeup of the course. But these are the sorts of people who have a lot of cultural capital and who have a lot of social capital. And so they had the professional and other networks sort of in place, which constitute, I think, one of the barriers to the industry for people who may come from minority or backgrounds which are less diverse and not well represented within the industry. That was 20 years ago. And as Ahmed says, right now, the industry is still overwhelmingly monocultural. Yes, you'll get people like Ahmed, you'll get people like yourselves, like Donna and like Michelle working in the industry, but overwhelmingly it is still a monocultural industry. Things are slowly changing. The universities are trying to encourage some diversity in this space, but the reality is that it's not an industry which is appealing for a whole reasons. And Ahmed mentioned some of those. There's a natural distrust of the media from certain, from people from certain communities. The other aspect to this, I mean, this is all anecdotal in terms of our personal sort of career trajectories in the media. As an academic, I have lined up, and this ties in with some of the stuff that Michelle was talking about. I've tied in figures from the last census, so 2016, before the current one. And in my research, I put those figures up against Screen Australia figures. And it was so revealing because the amount of diversity that we have in terms of our population is simply not reflected on screen. Like, it's just hardcore, the facts are just there. We've got, there was one area which was a bit of a positive, and that was that Indigenous representation on screen is slightly above the proportion of the population that Indigenous people make up, right? So that was only one area that was positive. Every other dimension of diversity, whether that be disability or cultural diversity, is simply not reflected in our media. So I think that sort of underlines, I guess, some of my the personal experiences that I've had over the past 20 years in terms of working in the industry and then eventually teaching it. I would love to just walk into a class and see somebody of African background tell me that they would like to be a sports reporter, with Fox Sports, but that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen for a while. But it's the change is happening. It's just probably a little bit too slowly for my tastes.
Speaking of sports journalism, a lot of your research has been around how race is framed in sports journalism specifically. Tell us a little bit about that work and how a lack of diversity within sports journalism manifests.
So it's really interesting in terms of the media's role, identity, that extends to all parts of the media. We know for sure that, what we see in terms of journalism, in terms of the news, really defines who is and who isn't Australian. When we think about Ahmed's, comments earlier in terms of the lockdown protests, for example, there was a lack of storytelling around why certain members of our community felt the need to join the lockdown protests. So the media, by and large, defines what is and what isn't Australian. And that is a process that is replicated throughout the world. And so when you're looking at a place like the United Kingdom, mentioned by Michelle, or like the United States, you could argue that the lived experiences of minorities in the United States is worse than in Australia. But when it comes to diversity reflected in them, they have a whole heap of lessons to teach us, because our media looks like it's stuck in the 1950s. You know, it was stuck in the pre-white Australia policy being lifted kind of days. And so this is replicated throughout the world. What is and isn't defined as, part of that country's national identity. And I find that reflected in sport as well. Sport is almost used as a yardstick for how good or how bad somebody assimilates. You know, we found research that indicates that sport is used as, something to measure how much somebody has integrated, and that's such a loaded word, integrated into day-to-day life. And so that's what a lot of my research looks at. Some sports or some codes, for instance, are represented in the media as a little bit foreign. And we're also looking, like most current research is looking at the coverage of the Olympic Games, the complete mix of obviously sport and politics, which is a little bit different, I guess, to day-to-day work as a journalist, but it's research that I enjoy, and research that I think is important, because as Michelle said, we want to see in the media people who look like us, who reflect us, and we don't want to be coded as not Australian. We don't want to be coded as foreign, and that plays through in sport.
Mm-hmm. I want to switch tack slightly and go back to you, Michelle, but just before I do, a reminder to our audience that we are open for audience questions. So if you do have anything you'd like to ask our panelists, type it into the comments box and we'll answer them shortly. Michelle, we'll be watching the Multicultural Film Festival official selection after this panel. To you, why is it so important to see diversity on our screens?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd like to discuss, I guess, off-screen roles, after we flesh that out. But, growing up in Australia, I'm a Chinese Malaysian Australian, and I pretty much didn't see anyone on screens who sort of had a similar story to me, like, look Chinese, but, grew up in Australia with a foot in two doors. And I think it's really important because, I guess for two reasons. One is that, for people from, I guess, multicultural communities, it's really important to, see that your story is on screen, because it's a representation of your culture that, as accepted by the mainstream media. And the other reason is, I think that it's really powerful for these representations to be beamed into every Australian home, so that people can turn on the TV and just see that people from different cultures are simply Australian, and it takes that element of unfamiliarity away. And if you're living in a place where you might not know anyone of different diverse cultures, that might be one of your only interactions with someone from a multicultural Australian background. So I think that's a really important part of that. But I think one thing that's really important to look at is, beyond casting and beyond who's on screen, I think it's really important to look at the systems in place for who is able to access those sort of off-screen roles. So, key creative roles, director, writer, producer, who is crafting and writing the stories that are about these particular communities. One thing that, I'm really looking into in my role in SBS is ensuring that there's authenticity of voice, so that when we do, tell stories about communities, that we're making sure that the people from those communities are involved in a really meaningful way behind the scenes in crafting that narrative, because I think that is the only way to ensure that we are, truly reflecting the community.
In terms of barriers to access in that particular space, we think of on-screen representation, but we often forget that there's a whole crew of people who are involved in a particular production. How I guess, what kind of difficulties exist or challenges exist in trying to encourage people to of diverse backgrounds to find those roles?
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking from my own experience, so I used to be a journalist, but also a TV writer and presenter. And I think one of the issues is that perhaps if your parents were migrants, they might not necessarily be integrated into those types of media roles and have that network into those existing power structures. And another thing is that I think the TV and film industry is quite opaque. And it is quite a closed network in a way, somewhat like journalism, um, in that it's very difficult to know how to get into the industry because often a lot of jobs are not advertised, and you have to be able to know the right people to know about the jobs that might be going behind the scenes. So I think that's one thing. And I think another difficulty that presents itself is, in order to access the industry, you might have to go from the ground up. And often, if these roles are not particularly well financially remunerated, it can be very challenging for people who, might come from a background where they don't have the necessary means to support a part-time creative role, and they don't have that fallback option. So I think that is something that, we need to talk about, because if we can't be getting people in creative positions because they don't have the means to support themselves, that is a very clear barrier to access.
And we're going to talk in a moment about, I guess, some solutions to the challenges that we face at the moment. And we have a question from the audience. Please discuss the way our multicultural communities are portrayed in the newspapers and on TV news. Historically, Australia hasn't done this well. Perhaps, Ahmed, you'd like to share your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I guess it's quite accurate. Like I think there's a number of things. There's the sort of the casual stuff of like not of sort of being ignorant and sort of not actually reaching out and finding out about communities. And then there's the more sort of, I guess, overt stuff that happens, which damages communities. We saw the impact of the African gangs narrative, which was particularly damaging, which saw, I guess, The Age lean on um, Nelly Yoa, who was a quote unquote community leader who did not have a community to lead. And we later found out a number of issues about him, a number of South Sudanese community leaders coming forward and saying he does not represent them, and that was the basis of one, their editorial about African gang problems, two, the issues in which he highlighted again in a second piece in his own op-ed, Nelio's op-ed, and then that sort of sway of feeling around African gang violence then led to political campaigns and a lot of people feeling deeply demonized and targeted, and there's a reason why in which communities feel this way, and why they don't approach media, and why when I call people asking if you want to tell your story, they're very reticent, and it takes a lot of time to get them, one, to trust me, even if they even know me, or even if we've got a level of familiarity through a mutual friend or something like that, and that's the issue. I remember a family friend picked me up prior to the lockdown a few months ago, and we were chatting, hadn't caught up for a while, and he asked me what I'm doing, and I said I'm a journalist at the ABC, and he was like, "Oh, you're a journalist? Like, why would you do that?" Like, and with all these sort of these feelings around apprehension around journalism and around the media and how they portray him, and then and like, who can blame him? And that, I think that's the challenge. How do we sort of get communities to trust media? But actually, no, maybe they shouldn't trust media. Maybe media should actively engage and make sure that, one, they're accurately reporting issues within communities. But also, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't shy away from like difficult subjects that need to be addressed. Like, if there's a difficult story within a community that needs to be told, you need to tell it. I don't care if it's going to cause an issue or whatever. Tell it the most sensitive way you can, and ensure that you're doing the right sort of duty of care of that story. So yeah, I think there's another issue. So there's issue of people feeling I guess the distrust to media, and then also internally media feeling that they can't touch certain stories, which I feel potentially problematic in its own right. How do we learn from past mistakes if we're not trying to do better?
Nasya, do you have any thoughts to add on this topic?
It's been really interesting listening to Ahmed's accounts of it, because sure, when I was working in the newsroom at SBS 20 years ago, similar sort of thing, and at the ABC a little bit after that, if there was a story that had to do with the Muslim community, I didn't get a lot of trust from people. You had to build that trust, and that's something that you have to actively do. Recently, when certain parts of Melbourne were identified as hotspots in terms of the outbreak last year for COVID-19, a couple of times I saw on TV reporters from commercial news organisations who looked like this was the very first time that they had set foot past Footscray or past Sun, people walking around Broadmeadows as if it was like another country, and I think that Ahmed is right. There's two aspects to this. There is not just the lack of people from these backgrounds that are the subject of the storytelling, but there's also that lack of trust, and there's a lack of knowledge, I guess. That's one thing that we also need to speak about, because it is such a closed shop, and because it is it's not even a monocultural, it's not even an industry that's dominated by one particular culture. It's an industry that's dominated by one socio-economically defined aspect of the dominant culture. And so when you get people working in this industry who tend to just socialize with people from, who share a similar background to them, then of course it's going to be difficult for them to tell stories about people growing up in public housing, people who, that's why I'm a firm believer in trying as much as possible to do some of the things that Michelle was speaking about, to try and encourage people to go not just in on-screen roles, but maybe within the broadcast journalism, part of the media, behind the scenes as well, as producers, producers for the ABC, somebody who operates the auto cue for news breakfast, right? It's not just the people whose bylines are put in the paper or online, or the people who sign off on their radio or TV stories. It's also the producers as well. We need to get more diverse, more representative, I guess, of the diversity that is the Australian population today. So there's a whole heap of issues, and if I knew how to solve it, I'd probably be a little bit richer than I am now.
Looking to the future now, as a variation on the broader Cultural Diversity Week theme, what does a diverse media landscape look like in 2030? Nasya, I might stay with you and then jump to Michelle afterwards.
I don't want to turn on, I don't want to turn on ABC News 24 or conversely a commercial news station and look at a scene reminiscent of the Australia that my parents arrived in the late 1970s. I want to turn on the TV and I want to see, and the ABC is getting there. Right, I have to say the ABC is getting there. SBS, that's its mandate. Okay, so I would expect, a more culturally diverse workforce. I want to turn on Channel 7, Channel 9, and I want to see people who represent my street. I want to see people who, I guess that sort of represents to me what a diverse media workforce might look like.
Michelle, what are your thoughts?
Well, I hope in 2030 that my role is redundant and that there doesn't need to be dedicated, content industry diversity managers. I hope that we get to a place where, that we don't even need the word diversity, right? That it's just taken that if you're from Australia, we come from a range of different backgrounds, whether that be multicultural, living with a disability, LGBTQI+, and this is just normal, and it's just a matter of course that you turn on TV and you see these stories and they are just normalized. I mean, that's where I hope that we can get to, because I think as long as we keep using the word diversity in a way that also is othering, right? Because we're diverse, but compared to whom? So I really want that to be something that's just a matter of course.
Ahmed, what does a diverse journalism landscape look like to you by 2030?
more people in the room. It's like enough of the only one, enough of like the firsts. I feel like by 2030 we should have enough firsts. The first this, the first that, the first. It's great that we have first, but the first just means that there've not been anyone before that, um, and I think that comes down to another thing that we need. Um, we need people who are not only the reporters, producers, as we've said, people behind the scenes, but also people upstairs. We need diverse editors. We need people who've got experience in the industry that can lend themselves to connecting to young diverse journalists who aren't sure about what they're doing. We need to stop pigeonholing journalists of color, should I say, into the op-ed pages where they write about their trauma and personal essays, which pay very little, which everyone knows, and then makes it difficult for them to enter the industry as reporters or producers. And I think by 2030, like Michelle mentioned, we need to stop positioning diversity amongst the sort of the monoculture, and the monoculture being sort of, I guess, whiteness in a sense, and look beyond that, and like Australia should have a diverse media across the board, and that doesn't need to be, well, it really shouldn't be something that's sort of legislated or quantified. It should just be there already, and hopefully by then we do have that.
And as a kind of, positive outlook, I suppose, into the future, how do we encourage media organizations to get there? We've talked about what the industry looks like now. We've talked about what we hope it will look like in 2030. What are some initiatives or actions that both individuals and organizations should and can take now to help us get to that 2030 ideal? Michelle, I know that you oversee quite a lot of diversity and inclusion content initiatives at SBS, and perhaps you might be able to speak to this first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are seeing a bit of a shift in that. I think media organizations, I can speak for the TV and film side, I think we're going in the right direction. We do want to get there, but I think a challenge is because, particularly in Australia, diversity in content is a new area. So I think people don't necessarily know where to begin or how to start. But I would say let's just start somewhere and try to work together. There's a lot of organizations that are really doing some great work in the space, such as Cinespace and Ice Parramatta. They're more grassroots organizations that connect with their communities and are building up the next generation of creators. So I think it's always really important to, I guess, not make assumptions about what creators from different equity deserving backgrounds need, but just talk to them and try and understand more about their world, what might be happening. And well, we do have a lot of initiatives at SBS and NITV. We have about 20 if you look across the board. And in the course of my role since January, so not too long, I've been reviewing them and chatting to people who have done them just to ensure that, when we do craft initiatives, that they lead to more than just one-off opportunities, right? I think it's important to think about how they play into a sustainable sort of career path, because when I think we talk about the next generation, you can work with sort of more training organizations to bring them into the industry, but I think it's about ensuring that they are coming to culturally safe spaces and ensuring retention, because, I used to be a journalist, and I guess I was in a perhaps similar position to Nasya and Ahmed, where I would often be perhaps the only person of color in the room, which is great. But I think we do have to be conscious of not overburdening people who are perhaps the only, you could say, quote unquote, diverse person in the room, and expecting them to, bear the burden of their whole community. But we do need to encourage and open up the doors so that we can have that critical mass and that they can be supported in a really, safe environment.
There's an audience question here. Is there any support now for people from different backgrounds, perhaps people with less privilege entering? This is specifically relating to journalism. I'm not sure whether perhaps Ahmed, you can talk about it in terms of journalism, but Michelle, I know there's also some say emerging writers initiatives, etc., that you're overseeing. But Ahmed, can you speak to this point around, is there support available for young journalists starting out, particularly people who don't come from, white upper middle class backgrounds?
It's difficult because a lot of the sort of support that I've been given has been super ad hoc. It's been me coming to really kind people and those really kind people helping me, and being available to have a coffee or a phone chat or have a read of an article that I'm drafting or give me advice on application or all these different things. And I think unfortunately, apart from like the Facebook groups or WhatsApp channels or whatever these sort of I guess more grassroots level stuff, there isn't a framework that really exists. And I think I think a big issue going off the sort of the question you put to Michelle around sort of changes in industry. I think one of the things that I think people don't realize is that like I grew up in Broadmeadows just to um I I remember chatting to my career counselor and asking him some advice about my application to do journalism at university, and he was shocked. I guess he was like, "Ahmed, are you sure you want to do this?" And I think what we need to be doing is going to schools in some of these outer suburban areas where people don't see themselves in media or that they don't think it's possible for them, and just like even at just the smallest level, just engage with those young people and be like, oh, well, this is what we do and this is how it happens and etc. Just to plant a seed, and that seed being planted then increases um, the possibility for these young people to even consider being in journalism or coming into the industry, um, and then those people hopefully can create that framework amongst themselves, and also industry whilst doing that can then start to think about, all right, so we've got a growing multicultural community interested in journalism who wants to enter the space. How do we ensure that they aren't left behind or aren't supported? But before even that happens, we need to ensure that people even see that it's a possibility. Because I remember being one of the few people in my journalism degrees, and I'm sure Nasya can speak to the fact that probably there's not very many people of color in her journalism degrees either. And I think that just comes through to the very beginning where people don't think it's a possibility.
Ahmed, I'm going to stay on you. We have another audience question. Has the move from more traditional media to online media caused more difficulties in the way communities are portrayed? Is the turnaround time for developing and reporting stories online a contributive issue?
I feel like there's two things, like the fact that we've got, I guess, digital media and social media, it's created a much more account, like media companies are now more accountable to their audiences than ever. And if communities feel targeted or demonized or what have you, they can speak back. Um, and so I do think there's may potentially a rush to things in this sort of digital age, but I also feel like that is doing a disservice to so much great digital journalism that's out there, um, which is which has the same sort of editorial rigor that comes through any sort of, I guess, print or broadcast publication. So I don't know. I tend to think that fact that we've got digital media now, it's opened so many avenues to people, and people can. And I also feel like it's added. Like I don't think I would have ever if it was 15 years. If I was 15 years older and it was before things like Twitter, Facebook, and whatever, and I was studying at university, I don't think I'd pick journalism just because I don't know why would I how would I even find a way to enter it? But like now I can just because I remember like emailing journalists in high school and people thankful like replying back to me, but like you couldn't do that then. So I don't know. I think digital media has created so many avenues, and also careers for people, and an ability for them to show their expertise without a sort of a legacy media type dictating how they do it. And I think that there's obviously negatives, but I think that's undoubtedly a positive thing.
We're running low on time now. Michelle, I want to jump back to you with regards to the question about support for people from less privileged backgrounds. Can you tell us a little bit about a couple of initiatives that you're overseeing at SBS? Perhaps let's start with the Emerging Writers Incubator.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to plug that. So, as I mentioned, I oversee the content diversity initiatives at SBS because I want to meet more people who are of different diversities, and I want them to apply for our initiatives and get in the fold. So the Emerging Writers Incubator is an initiative that we launched this year. How it works is we are searching for people from a range of different equity-deserving backgrounds. And over 3 years, we're going to take 6 a year, and they will be placed for a year in a production company so that they can work across the production company's entire slate. They can learn their craft and they can work on a number of projects. And I'm really excited about this initiative because it is 1 year, so it gives them a little bit more time to build those relationships and learn their craft, and also not have to worry about having a part-time job to support their creative endeavors. Another one that we did launch this year is Curious Australia. So it's at the same target audience. We're looking for these untold stories, and we're really calling out to people from equity-deserving backgrounds. And this is a 30-minute documentary initiative. And we do have a number of other programs. I won't plug them all, but if you want to learn more, we do have a content initiative page on the SBS website, and we want your stories. So come on, click on the page.
Nasya, I'm going to give you the last word. I'm wondering whether, as someone who's teaching a lot of young people at entering the industry, you have any specific advice for people who are of diverse backgrounds, who perhaps might not see a clear path for them moving forward. What words of advice or encouragement might you have?
My words of advice or encouragement would be that the industry that you might enter in a few years is a very different industry to the one that I tried to enter so many years ago. So there are heaps and heaps of opportunities. You don't want to be the active object in history. You want to be a subject that helps to write Australian history. So I'd encourage people from diverse backgrounds to what I think is a different years ago and worked in for a long time. But more than that, people who are part of the dominant culture, I think they should also go beyond their comfort zone, reach out to organisations like Media Diversity Australia and expand their contact books and not just speak to the same individual talent. We have so many people from diverse backgrounds who are represented across the professions. And so firstly, for people who do come from diverse backgrounds, consider the media as a career, but those who are from the dominant culture, in terms of your storytelling, probably branch out a little bit and try and speak and make contacts that represent Australia as diverse as we are in 2020.
I think that's an excellent point to finish on. Thank you so much to our three panelists, Ahmed, Yussuf, Michelle Cheng, and Nasya Bahfen, for your really insightful and interesting comments. As I mentioned at the beginning of this session, what will follow is the Multicultural Film Festival, which showcases short films that explore stories of diversity and inclusion. Each year, the shortlisted feature films feature characters who are encountering new ways of life, struggling with feeling isolated in a new country or within their culture's traditions, or beginning to embrace and celebrate their differences. We'll be showing 8 of the shortlisted films in just a moment. The screening will play for just over an hour, so please grab some refreshments, get comfortable, and enjoy the films. Thanks so much to our panelists again, and we hope you have a good evening.